terrific equipment to have a battle with. When you get G.I. Joe and the authentic G.I. Joe equipment.
Now, guys, if you grew up in the 1980s, then chances are that you spent many of your afternoons watching a bunch of Joes battling the slimy, slithery Cobra operatives in some outrageous as hell missions with secret weapons and hidden underground bases and some very cool transportation options. Yeah, for so many of us, G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero was our literal childhood. Watching Duke, Scarlett, and Snake Eyes take on Cobra Commander and Destro Baroness Duo was our comfort corner and even our whole world back then. It was genuinely like a whole cultural phenomenon back then. But, you know, now that we look back at the show, you'll realize something interesting and weird. Like quite a few other cartoons that were unfortunately just canceled abruptly, G.I. Joe, too, didn't get a impressive final battle of sorts or some epic ending that would be a worthy send-off for this iconic show. Nah, it just sort of disappeared and faded away from our lives. In fact, depending on whether you're talking about the Sunbow cartoon, the animated movie, the later DC continuation, or the Marvel comic book, it got several random disconnected endings here and there. So, the answer to the big question, how exactly did G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero end? The answer is actually quite complicated, but don't worry, guys, because today we're taking you through all those fragmented, weird endings of our beloved franchise, and you might even be surprised where we found the most meaningful farewell. Hint, it wasn't in animation at all. So guys, let's get right into it.
It's G.I. Joe against Cobra and Destro, fighting to save the day.
The rise and fall of G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero. Okay, so to really understand what the hell happened, we've got to start from the beginning. G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero debuted in the early 1980s, and on TV it started off as a 5-part miniseries by Sunbow and Marvel in 1983. These two giants, along with Hasbro, made one of the biggest multimedia empires as a result. With the holy trinity of comics, TV, and toys, they were pretty much unstoppable. They made the cartoon of the decade and had one of the most impressive rosters of characters, especially the villains and antagonists. There was something for basically every child. But there was one big issue. The whole thing was entirely built around those little plastic things, and this led to a whole host of problems. First of all, because this series revolved around the toys and needed to boost toy sales, a lot of our favorite characters just didn't get enough screen time or pizzazz. After all, what's the point of spending a bunch of episodes building a character arc when that particular character isn't even being sold, right? This also meant that at times characters were just suddenly dropped off the show. No reason, no storyline, nothing. Just replaced with whatever new toy was sitting on the shelves. And things got even worse by 1986. You see, kids were pretty easily swayed by the newest shiny thing that was on the market, especially if their friends had it too. And I mean, they still are. So, when Nintendo Entertainment Systems came out, kids got over the stupid action toys real quick. And suddenly, they were begging their parents for video games, which were taking over the world. Now, at the same time, the TV landscape was overwhelmed and flooded with a bunch of other cheap cartoons. And considering how much money Sunbow and Hasbro were pouring into the show for smooth animation and great music, it simply wasn't sustainable any longer. Especially with the way the toy sales are dropping, you know? And the moment the profits start going down, they just pulled the plug. Even G.I. Joe wasn't immune to all these changes, I guess. And that's the real reason why the show didn't end the right way.
All this for that?
Some nights it just don't pay to get out of bed.
How did G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero end? So the Sunbow cartoon had its final episode air on November 20th, 1986, written by Buzz Dixon and Michael Charles Hill. And you probably went in expecting some final epic showdown where Cobra Commander is finally defeated for good. And I'm sure you were disappointed, because the final Sunbow episode literally feels like any other adventure from the middle of the series. And if you watched it without knowing it was the last episode, you wouldn't even realize that the episode marked the end of an entire era. The final episode of the Sunbow cartoon was called Into Your Tent I Will Silently Creep, and the plot is surprisingly anticlimactic. It's mostly about people's personal stuff going missing, or at least that's how it seems. The episode starts with the Cobras setting up yet another evil plan, but the Joes arrive and thwart them. Cross Country, in fact, debilitates them with his music tape, which eventually gets destroyed in a blast. You know, the usual. But when he goes back to the Joe headquarters to retrieve another of his tapes, It quietly gets stolen by a weird creature that looks like a mix between a rat and a lizard. And his isn't the only thing that's gone missing. Everyone's losing some personal item or another. Sci-Fi's lost his calendar, Lowlight has lost some new scope, Roadblock loses his cooking tools, Dial Tone loses his electronic gear. But no one took it as personally as Cross Country. He was absolutely fuming, and he wasn't having it one bit. So he decided to take it into his own hands and get to the bottom of this mystery. And I actually like his plan because he makes the smart move of leaving bait and finally manages to see the creature behind the missing items as it disappears right back into the vents. As he crawls in after it, somehow wriggling through the tight vents. He even walks through a sewer. The sheer dedication this guy has, man. No one ever came between him and his music. This is your warning. But guess what he finds, guys? A whole massive Cobra secret society headquarters. Probably a temple would be a better term. You see, he was hiding out because Serpentor had taken over Cobra, and he was gathering a secret society called the Coil. In the meeting happening then, Cobra Commander speaks about how they're still dedicated to the cause of the extinction of Serpentor and his deranged scientist sidekick, Dr. Mindbender. He wants to return the Cobra power to the rightful heir, aka himself, duh. And honestly, this is probably the most important part about this whole episode, because it sets up what was the actual finale of the Sunbow era, G.I. Joe the movie. The rest of the episode is again just your typical shenanigans. Cross Country gets caught by the Dreadnoks as he's trying to leave, and he has to jump literal lava moats only to eventually be captured by Cobra again. He still manages to free himself with a hidden key, and in the meantime, his G.I. Joe backup has already arrived, and together they overthrow Cobra's operations, where he was using people as slaves to mine. Yeah, that's it. That was the finale of the Sunbow animated cartoon era. Disappointing, right? I know. There's no heroic ending or satisfying Cobra defeat or even a G.I. Joe celebration. It's just Intel Collection. The only one happy with that ending was probably Cross Country, who got his music back.
G.I. Joe will return after these messages.
The uncomfortable truth. No real finale. So, with that underwhelming last episode, the Sunbow series simply ended without any farewell or closure even. And this was particularly tough for longtime fans. These characters were literally part of our weekly routines and suddenly they were just gone. Of course, we can't really blame the writers and creators because they probably had no idea it would be the last episode when they made it. And that's why everything just remains unresolved. The Cobras still have all those secret bases and obscene amounts of money to fuel their world domination plans. The Baroness and Destro are still out there ready to cause trouble. There was no emotional goodbye for the Joes, and we didn't even get to see the Snake Eyes versus Storm Shadow ending, let alone the Duke and Scarlett story. So obviously the fans wanted more, and that's where the movie came in. The 1987 movie, the big finale feeling. So guys, if you wanted a real finale, you had to go to the theaters for G.I. Joe the movie in 1987. It was supposed to be the big event that picks up from where the TV show left off. And let me tell you, it definitely felt huge. The stakes were much higher. There were a whole bunch of new faces and intros, and the story veered off into this blend of sci-fi, biological stuff, and ancient myths. I don't even know how they pulled off that genre merge, but they did. In fact, the movie completely changes Cobra's history. We find out that Cobra Commander didn't just wake up one day and invent Cobra. Instead, his origin story is actually linked to an ancient reptilian civilization called Cobra La, which was ruled by their leader, Globulus. And they were a thriving civilization that practically ruled the Earth. But then the Ice Age happened, and humans came into the picture. And with all the science and tech advancements, they just couldn't keep up and retreated into the Himalayas. But, of course, they were always on the lookout for their next evil plan. And then the opportunity presented itself in the form of a nobleman who was working with biological weapons. Yeah, that nobleman eventually became Cobra Commander and was given the mission of returning the Cobra Law to its former glory. But, as we all know from the Sunbow cartoons, Cobra Commander was as useless and incompetent as they come. So, remember how the final episode ended with Cobra being split into two factions, as Serpentor usurping Cobra from Cobra Commander? Well, it was actually Globulus who had planted Dr. Mindbender's dreams and psyche to create Serpentor in the first place. And his evil master plan? It was to use mutating spores to turn all of humanity into mindless snakes so that he and his people could take back the planet. Yeah, as you can see, there was a whole lot going on. We even got a group of new recruits called the Rawhides, who were led by Duke's half-brother, Lieutenant Falcon. Now, the final battle was taking place inside the caves of Cobra La, and the unimaginable happened. This was probably one of the most shocking moments in G.I. Joe back then. During the fight, Serpentor throws a sharp snake spear right at Falcon, but Duke intercepts it at the last moment, and it pierces straight into Duke's chest. He almost looks like he's dead. But fortunately, after the final climax, we find out that he's just in a coma. I kid you not, people were full on crying until then. Interestingly enough, the original plan was to kill off Duke, and that's why the animation was also made to look like he was about to die. But then Transformers had come out a little while ago and traumatized kids by killing off Optimus Prime. So naturally, Hasbro panicked and said, fuck that, we'll just add some off-screen voiceover lines saying he's slipped into a coma and is woken up. So how did the film actually end? Well, Sergeant Slaughter and Falcon launched a final attack, destroyed the Spore Machine, and the whole ancient civilization just exploded. But the worst fate was probably Cobra Commander's. Before the climax, Cobra Commander was punished for his repeated failures by Globulus, and the punishment was brutal. He was exposed to those very spores and turned into a snake. But of course, he wasn't entirely mindless, because it was he who eventually led Joe to Cobra Law. But still, brutal punishment. The movie was still a better ending to the Sunbow era, because at least it gave us something to talk about, even if it was just criticizing some of the story choices. At least it was something, you know? Things felt larger, bigger, like they had consequences. And even though the movie did mark the ending of one era, the franchise had more to give us.
But they'll stay till the fight's won. G.I. Joe will dare. G.I. Joe.
The DIC continuation, Cobra Commander, comes back. Considering that G.I. Joe toys were still making money, of course the story wasn't just gonna stop with the movie. So from 1989 to 1992, a new studio called DIC took over the cartoon, and they changed things back from the movie real quick. The cartoon began with a 5-part story called Operation Dragonfire, and immediately the Baroness found the snake version of Cobra Commander and put him into a machine that turned him back into a human. So the Commander was back at it, and of course he couldn't let that sneaky Serpentor get away with his betrayal. So he threw him out, turned him into a pet iguana, and took back control of Cobra. So the movie ending quite literally didn't matter anymore, as the whole war between the Cobra and the Joes restarted all over again. Only this time the show became even sillier. Now the final DIC episode was called Legend of Metalhead, and it aired on January 20th, 1992. And if you were tired of finales that weren't actually finales at all, this one's gonna annoy you even more. This wasn't a real finale. Not even close. The whole episode is sort of a comedy clip show episode. There's basically no new narrative content. There's no high-stakes explosive finale, and more like a look back at the DIC series. You know those filler memory lane episodes that all sitcoms have these days? The only difference is that there's not the actual finale. So what happens is basically that Metalhead, who is the explosives guy of Cobra, his grandmother was coming to visit him at the Cobra base. Now, he'd obviously been lying to his grandmother for years, telling her that he was actually a top-tier corporate executive working at some fancy, super successful business corporation. And of course, they have to try and keep up that illusion to protect his lie. So Metalhead convinces Cobra Commander and the rest of the gang to redecorate the whole command center. And lo and behold, as they turn it into a fake corporate office building. And as he takes his grandma on a tour of the whole headquarters, he has to try and explain all the explosions and military-grade weapons and stuff she sees outside or on the monitors. At the end of the day, the Cobra were still not dismantled, no characters died, the Cobra vs. Joe war still didn't get any conclusion or anything. It's just a bunch of nostalgia clips to close out the whole DIC era. The comic book ending. Issue number 155, A Letter from Snake Eyes. Alright guys, now interestingly enough, if you're looking for a genuinely meaningful ending, then you aren't going to find it in animation at all. Instead, the most emotional goodbye comes from the Marvel comic book. And the comics were pretty different from the cartoons, considering that the cartoons were mainly just to push toys. And in contrast, the comics actually had grit and substance. Of course, major credit here goes to Larry Hama, who was a Vietnam veteran himself and made these really serious human military stories for the comic. But by 1994, with the whole video game boom, toy sales went down, and once Hasbro canceled the toy line, naturally Marvel also canceled the comic. So Larry Hama wanted to give fans a real goodbye, and he wrote the final issue. The issue, number 155, is titled A Letter from Snake Eyes. I know, right? Even the title sounds good. And it isn't the ending you're expecting, just a simple, somber letter from one of the standout characters of the franchise, explaining the futility of war. It's emotional and heartfelt and honestly really poetic. The comic begins with Wade Collins in a forest as he accidentally leads his troops straight into an encampment of Northern Vietnam Army personnel. Fortunately, Snake Eyes steps up and begins the counterattack, only for the audience to realize that it was actually a nightmare flashback of Wade's. We also see Sean, Wade's son, who's soon turning 17, and needs a father's signature to enlist in the army. Of course he wants to follow in his father's footsteps, right? But Wade doesn't seem keen at all. He tells his son that he doesn't really know what being a soldier is all about. But Sean seems dead set and furious at his parents' reactions. So he tells his son to just write directly to Snake Eyes about it, his decision, thinking at least to listen to a real warrior. Then the comic shifts over to the G.I. Joe base, and Snake Eyes has mail. For the first time ever since his family died in that car crash. Of course, he accepts the letter and reads it. It's from Sean, the adopted son of Wade Collins. And oh boy, is he frustrated. He's a teenager who hates everyone around him. He's actually really eloquent in the letter. He talks of how honor and duty are dead. And even the people who were supposed to be upstanding are ending up in jail because of horrible crimes. So in a world that's going to shit, what's so wrong with wanting to be a man of honor? A soldier. Now this is when Snake Eyes sits and pens down his reply. He starts off by telling Sean that there's really no honor or glory in being a soldier, only long stretches of interminable boredom punctuated by brief flurries of pure terror. Damn, who knew the silent ninja had that up his sleeve? He explains to Sean that there's literally no winning in this profession. Even if you win the fight, you still lose. You lose the battle, you lose your comrades, and you lose your sanity. He then tells Sean the story of Raymond Escobedo. He was in that team that we saw in the very first panel with Wade and Snake Eyes. While in Vietnam, Ramon received a letter from his mom saying that his brother had finished his training in the infantry. And considering that Ramon's time in Vietnam was coming to an end, it would mean his brother would then be eligible to be shipped here because two members of a family couldn't serve at the same time. So, guess what he did? No matter how much he wanted to go home, he stayed and extended his tour just to keep his brother away. Except that it was all futile since he died in that ambush we saw at the beginning anyway. Same with Dickie Saperstein. He had barely 2 months left and got a letter from his mom saying that his dad was hospitalized and needed an operation. So, for an extra cash bonus for a heart valve dilation, he extended his tour. Of course, his father died on the operating table, his mom went crazy, and he was blown up by a mine. And Stalker? Well, he didn't join the army for honor or glory. He just needed to get off the dangerous streets of Detroit. He wrote elaborate letters to his mom because he had lied and told her he worked in an office in Germany. And in those few letters, they could all momentarily escape the harsh reality and imagine a fantasy world. You see, Stalker just didn't understand why anyone would enlist and serve in Vietnam for honor or adventure. It was no adventure at all. Snake Eyes ended the letter with his own story. He didn't know what his reasons were, but he knew the consequences he returned to. He lost everything, including his family. It was Hawk and Stalker who came for him eventually. But then, on a mission in the Middle East, he was caught in a blast on a helicopter and it burned his face entirely. They couldn't save his appearance or his voice. He warned Sean that the army doesn't give appreciation if that's why he's joining. Neither is the nation grateful. And the worst of all, he'll absolutely see the worst of humanity, the most evil, vile, and cruel sides of mankind. But hey, at least he would also see the best of humanity too in his comrade. Sean indeed gets the letter and of course is moved by it. He had no idea what war was like after all. He was only a teenager still. He realizes that he still had more to think about before making his final decision. And dad and son embrace. This is why this ending is so powerful. It's because of the restraint it shows. After years of battles and secret missions and high-tech weapons, the series ends on this quiet, sobering, reflective note. Instead of celebrating war and conflict, it actively questions it and leaves us with some pearls of wisdom to ponder upon long after we've read the panels. This ending reminds us what the comics were actually about in the first place. It was never just about selling some toy line or action figures. It was about friendship and camaraderie, loyalty and sacrifice. This is the realest ending you'll get, guys. Behind the scenes, the animation myth and the voice cast. Now guys, there are actually some cool facts about how the final TV episode, Into Your Tent I Will Silently Creep, was made. Now, a lot of fans think G.I. Joe was made by Filmation, the studio that made He-Man, but it was actually made by Sunbow and Marvel, and the drawing was done by Toei Animation in Japan. That's why G.I. Joe looked so much smoother and had better action scenes than other 80s shows. And as you know, the script was written by Buzz Dixon and Michael Charles Hill, and they were just superb at putting in whatever new toys Hasbro wanted to sell, while still making the dialogue fun. And of course, because they thought they were just making yet another normal episode for season 2, they didn't even know it was the end. But it was actually the voice actors who really made the show legendary. They're the ones who made the show and the finale memorable. They had some of the most recognizable voice casts in action cartoon history. First, you had Jackson Beck's narration that gave us the whole military newsreel feel. And then, of course, there was Christopher Collins, or Chris Latta, who makes Cobra Commander one of the most iconic voices ever. That laugh and the screams and screeches will never not be remembered. Then there was Michael Bell, who voiced not just one or two, but a bunch of characters, including Duke, Blowtorch, Clutch, Major Blood, and Scrap Iron. And for the final episode, he worked with Arthur Bernhardt, who gave Destro his voice full of gravitas. That's one of the biggest reasons why Destro stood out so much, except for the silver face, of course. But unfortunately, the finale episode just failed to acknowledge any of this history. There are no farewell speeches, no cast tributes, no emotional send-offs. But that doesn't matter anymore because these voices have literally been set in stone. People still talk about Cobra Commander's high-pitched screeches. What came next? However, guys, even after the original cartoon faded away, G.I. Joe just refused to disappear. The Real American Hero toy line didn't end after the cartoon and continued through the late 80s and early 90s, with new releases of figures, vehicles, and sub-teams, before finally ending in 1994, the same year that Marvel's comic concluded. The timing obviously wasn't a coincidence. After all, the comic and the toy line and cartoons, all of them had supported each other and boosted sales and viewers like one big ecosystem. So naturally, as the cartoon ended, it started a domino effect. And one by one, so did the comics and then the toy line as well. But fortunately, the story didn't stay over for too long. The Marvel comic run by Larry Hama ended with issue number 155 in 1994. And then 7 years later, in 2001, Devil's Due Publishing took up the license, revived the comic, and continued the story right where the Marvel era had left things off. Yeah, the world had changed, but the Cobras were back once again from their long hiatus. So Duke brought back all the previous G.I. Joe members who were practically veterans by that time, to face the Cobra threat once again. So it didn't reboot everything, but instead took the much smarter route of building upon the foundation that Marvel had already created. So the Joes became older veterans who were training a whole new generation of Joes and getting new recruits to face the more modern version of Cobra. And I actually liked it a lot. And though it initially started off as the new G.I. Joe A Real American Hero series, it eventually also expanded into more comic projects, which was the whole point in the first place. But then things became really complicated. And I mean really. Because later, IDW Publishing brought Larry Hama back and resumed the original continuity, beginning with issue number 155.5 and then number 156. They basically completely ignored the Devil's Due continuation and created a whole new different path instead. And this run went right up to issue number 300 before IDW lost the license. Now, this is actually a very important point because it marked a divergence in the G.I. Joe series. Fans could now choose one of two possible futures after the Marvel number 155 issue. One followed the Devil's Due continuity, and the other followed Larry Hama's continuation. And this mainly depends on which continuity you prefer. No judgment here. And the story didn't end there. Yeah, guys, we've had an impossibly long journey with this franchise, and it's still alive. So after IDW reached issue number 300 and lost the license, Skybound Entertainment continued the Hama continuity of G.I. Joe A Real American Hero, with issue number 301 in November of 2023. And holy shit, this continuation extended the storyline that had begun like 4 decades earlier. This makes Larry Hama's version of G.I. Joe one of the longest running continuities ever associated with the toy franchise, which is huge. And then beyond the comics, we got a shit ton of reboots and other reinventions. We got G.I. Joe Extreme, which tried to take an edgier route as Hasbro was trying its best to modernize and reinvent the whole brand for a new generation. Then in the 2000s, we got 3D animated movies like Spy Troops and Valor vs. Venom, which were all direct-to-video projects. After that, there was Sigma 6, which low-key looked like a fast-paced anime. Eventually, adults finally got a G.I. Joe that they could genuinely watch and enjoy. Not that we wouldn't want to go back and watch the cartoons as well, but you know what I mean. Resolute had this whole dark and adult vibe with real violence where characters actually died. And of course, there was G.I. Joe Renegades, which gave us a whole new storyline where the Joes team turned into fugitives hiding from Cobra, which was now a legit corrupt corporation. And last but not least, we got 3 big live-action Hollywood movies with G.I. Joe The Rise of Cobra in 2009, followed by G.I. Joe Retaliation in 2013, and Snake Eyes in 2021. And this just goes to prove that everyone still recognizes and loves these characters almost just as much. Especially because it's not over yet, guys. The future of the franchise. The franchise is still alive and kicking, and the G.I. Joe future is active now more than ever. First off, there's Paramount that's exploring a bunch of new directions, including separate scripts from Danny McBride and Max Landis. They're still trying to figure out what the future of G.I. Joe will look like and what they want it to look like, especially after the Snake Eyes film didn't land all that perfectly. And recent reports are even saying that Landis' treatment was passed over. His idea was to show a world where the Cobra had successfully taken over the world and had reduced the Joes to an underground conspiracy theory, which I'm not gonna lie, Kinda sounds cool, but I guess they're cooking up something different. Then, of course, there's the long-awaited and rumored Transformers G.I. Joe crossover, which is still in development hell. Even more so because recent reports are saying that it's not the next project in the timeline. So the idea hasn't been rejected or abandoned, it's just stuck in limbo. And finally, the comics have also been cooking, as the Energon universe is really fleshing out all the OG G.I. Joes in their new unique way and bringing them together with Transformers characters. G.I. Joe was never really about reaching the end of the war. It was about people fighting it. And ironically, the most memorable goodbye comes from the man who remained silent the entire franchise. So guys, which ending was your favorite? Let us know in the comments down below. As usual, please smash that like button if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to our channel for more G.I. Joe content, and ring that notification bell so that when we put more G.I. Joe content up, you don't miss the notifications. We'll see you soon. Until then, go Joes! Stay marvelous!